When the heavy door of Brookview Nursing Center clicked shut behind me, the sound echoed like a coffin lid sealing. That wasn't a metaphor. It felt real, final. I stood frozen, my shoes glued to the sterile tile as the nurse in pastel scrubs smiled and chirped. "Welcome, Ms. Warren. Room 312 is just down the hall. Your daughter said everything is ready." My daughter, my only child, Natalie. 18 years old and apparently capable of legally disposing of me like expired medication. I wasn't senile. I wasn't even sick. I was 38 years old, a working mother, a licensed nurse. But in the eyes of the court, I was now someone who needed to be put away for my own good. Just 3 hours earlier, I had been home reheating leftover pasta, exhausted after a double shift. I still had my badge on when Natalie walked in with two men. One wore a suit, the other had a leather folder. I thought maybe they were from school or some job application. But she smiled that too smooth smile I hadn't seen since she started dating Derek. "Mom," she said sweetly, "these men are here to help you. You've been under so much stress lately. We think it's time you had some rest." I blinked. Me and the professionals. You've been forgetting things, yelling at the microwave, writing checks to people who don't exist. I laughed, a short, stunned laugh. "What are you talking about?" One of the men held out papers. "Legal, stamped. Temporary guardianship has been granted to Ms. Natalie Warren due to observed cognitive decline. It's all approved. You'll be well taken care of." That's when my heart dropped into my stomach. I turned to Natalie and saw not the baby I once nursed through colic, not the girl who cried at Pixar movies, but a stranger with dead eyes and perfect makeup. I had raised a daughter who just erased me with a pen, and now she was watching me unravel with the coolness of a bank teller closing an account. "You think I'm crazy?" I whispered. "No, Mom," she said softly. "I think you're tired and confused. But that's okay. You're in good hands now." That's when I knew I was being buried alive and my own child was holding the shovel. Brookview wasn't some healing retreat. It was a well-decorated trap. They took my phone. They said it was for mental rest. I asked to call a lawyer. They told me I wasn't allowed to make legal decisions. I asked to leave. They said I was under temporary protective guardianship. Translation, I was legally powerless. Natalie had arranged it all. She filed paperwork, backed it with staged evidence and a medical note from a shady psychologist I'd never seen, and the court approved it without ever seeing me in person. No hearing, no defense, no warning, just a signature. And with that, everything I owned transferred into her hands. By the end of the day, I learned more. Natalie had emptied our joint accounts I had built through overtime shifts and missed holidays. $5 million gone. Some of it from the house I inherited from my grandmother. She sold it behind my back. No consultation, no dignity. Just a quiet listing, a cash buyer, and a headline I would see later on a real estate site: "Teen entrepreneur buys downtown penthouse in full cash deal." I zoomed in on the photo. Natalie smiling like she'd just conquered the world. I wanted to scream. That night in Brookview, lying on a paper-thin mattress under fluorescent lights, I stared at the ceiling and let the weight crush me. I had been erased. My voice, my name, my agency, my identity. I was no longer a mother, no longer a nurse, no longer a woman with legal standing, just a patient ID number with no say in her own life. And the worst part, the law said it was okay. That was the moment something broke and something else woke up. I wasn't dead yet, and Natalie hadn't won. Not really, because what she hadn't counted on was that I had lived my whole life surviving, scraping, building from nothing. She thought I would fold, disappear quietly. She thought the court's stamp was a final word. She was wrong. She didn't understand that when you bury a woman like me alive, she doesn't suffocate. She digs her way out. And then she burns everything down. Before Natalie turned 18, I would have sworn on my life that we were close. Not perfect, but close. I raised her on my own after her father walked out when she was 2. There was no backup plan, no trust fund, no weekends off. Just me, a nursing license and a rented apartment with secondhand furniture and a coffee maker that barely worked. I gave her everything. Every birthday party, every field trip fee, every last-minute emergency room visit, I was there every single time. I picked up night shifts so she could have new clothes for prom, and I skipped sleep so I could sit through her school plays even when she only had one line. We had late-night movie nights on the couch with microwaved popcorn and blankets up to our chins. I told her she could be anything, and I meant it. I never thought she'd choose to become this. Somewhere between 17 and 18, Natalie started changing. It wasn't sudden, it was subtle, like fog rolling in while you're distracted. She got secretive, polished, dismissive. She stopped calling me mom and started using my first name when we disagreed. She began talking about money in ways that made me uncomfortable, phrases like liquid assets and early financial independence. I asked her where she picked that up. She said her boyfriend was teaching her how to think like a CEO. Derek. 22 with a LinkedIn profile full of buzzwords and a smile that never touched his eyes. I met him once. He called me ma'am in a tone that felt like mockery, the kind of man who wore a Rolex he hadn't earned and bragged about leveraging opportunities. I warned Natalie he was bad news. She said I was old-fashioned and paranoid. I didn't press further. I should have. But I was tired, and she was almost grown. I told myself to trust her. Then, small things started happening. Our shared bank account meant for household bills, and Natalie's college fund started showing unexplained withdrawals. I noticed she had a new iPad, then a designer purse. When I asked, she said Derek had bought them. The numbers didn't add up, but every time I questioned her, she accused me of being controlling. She even cried once, said I was trying to keep her dependent. It stung. But I backed off. I thought maybe I was being overprotective. Maybe I was the problem. That's what abusers do, isn't it? Make you doubt your own instincts. It wasn't just money. Natalie started watching me, really watching like a researcher studying a subject. She asked what medications I was taking, whether I'd been forgetting things lately, if I was feeling anxious. I told her it was just stress from work, that I was fine. I didn't realize she was collecting statements, building a case. One afternoon I came home from work and she had a therapist in the living room, someone I'd never seen. She introduced him as just a friendly consult. I didn't know she had recorded the session. She asked me leading questions. Had I been misplacing things? Was I feeling overwhelmed? Had I ever thought about quitting work? I answered honestly. I thought we were having a conversation. I didn't know she'd cut it into a video that made me look unstable. She used it as part of her guardianship petition. She said I was slipping. And because I was tired, because I wasn't perfect, because I had cried once in the kitchen when I thought no one was looking, the court believed her. She built an entire narrative around my exhaustion, turned my sacrifices into signs of mental decline. Every missed payment was deliberate, every complaint at work a red flag. Natalie wrote the script and the court played along. I never got to defend myself. By the time I knew there was a case, the order had already been signed. That's how easy it was for my daughter to erase me. $5 million. That's what she took. The house, the investments, the retirement account I'd scraped together since my 20s. Gone. She said she needed to protect our legacy. In truth, she saw an opportunity, and I made it too easy. I let her into my passwords. I gave her access to accounts thinking I was teaching her responsibility. She used it to build a financial paper trail that justified my removal. In 3 days, she became my guardian, my jailer, my thief. That's the price I paid for trust. I gave her my life. She sold it, and the court applauded. That was when I understood that love isn't armor. Sometimes love is the blade they use to cut you open. Natalie wasn't born cruel. I still believe that. She came into the world screaming and clinging to me like I was the only thing keeping her grounded, which I was. Her father, Brad, bailed before she could say her first word. He wasn't abusive, just indifferent, quietly vanished from our lives with the cowardice of someone who thinks ghosting is a form of closure. I never chased him. I never wanted Natalie to grow up watching me beg a man for scraps of attention. I told her early on, we're a team, you and me, and for a long time we were. But I see now that the rot didn't come from nowhere. It started small, like hairline cracks in a wall that looks sturdy from a distance. Natalie grew up watching me stretch myself thin. She saw me nod and smile when I was exhausted, say, I'm fine when I was falling apart. I thought I was teaching her resilience. I was teaching her that silence equals strength, that self-sacrifice is a mother's duty, that exhaustion is normal. And I never realized she was interpreting that as weakness. From the time she was a child, Natalie liked control. She always wanted to know what the plan was, who was picking her up, why the rules were the way they were. If I told her no, she didn't cry, she plotted. When she was 10, she convinced the neighbor's kid to switch Halloween costumes with her so she could get the better one. When I found out, she smiled and said I negotiated. I laughed. I thought she was clever. Now I wonder if that was the first red flag. In high school, things escalated. Natalie didn't rebel with parties or drugs. She rebelled with power plays. She told teachers she was emotionally neglected when I asked her to do her own laundry. She posted online that I was toxic because I told her she couldn't have a car at 16. At the time, I blamed teenage hormones. Now, I see it differently. She was testing the world, seeing how far her charm and manipulation could take her. And people believed her. She had the kind of face that made strangers trust her. Soft features, bright eyes, a poised demeanor that said, "I'm composed and kind." It was a lie, but it was a convincing one. I noticed the shift most clearly when she started dating Derek. He was the mirror she didn't know she needed, equally self-absorbed, equally transactional. He spoke to her like she was a Ventura portfolio he could manage. I watched them feed off each other, building a dynamic that was less romantic and more strategic. He once told her in front of me, "Your mom's old school. She doesn't understand leverage." Natalie laughed. I didn't. That was the first time I felt genuinely afraid of my daughter. Not annoyed, not disappointed, afraid. Because she didn't defend me. She agreed with him. It wasn't long after that conversation that Natalie began pulling away. She'd spend hours locked in her room, on calls, whispering about contingencies and asset transfers. When I asked questions, she said I was paranoid. When I pushed harder, she called me controlling. I thought we were just going through a rough patch. I thought it was part of growing up. I didn't realize she was laying the groundwork to steal my life. What I didn't see then but see now with brutal clarity is that Natalie never wanted independence. She wanted ownership. She didn't want to grow up and build something of her own. She wanted to take what I had already built. It was easier, cleaner. And when you grow up watching a mother who never says no, who folds herself in half to make sure you're whole, you start to believe she doesn't have edges. You forget she can cut back. The betrayal didn't come from a stranger. It came from someone I created, nurtured, trusted. Someone who had watched me bleed to keep her safe. And maybe that's what made her bold enough to do what she did. She didn't think I'd fight back. She thought I'd roll over, apologize for being in the way, and disappear quietly like all the other women who've been made invisible by their own children's ambition. She thought I was too soft, too tired, too broken. But Natalie forgot something important. I raised her. I know exactly what she's capable of, because I was the one who taught her how to survive. Now she was about to learn that I hadn't forgotten how. The first time I truly understood how deep Natalie's betrayal went was when I tried to leave Brookview. It was 2 days after I'd arrived, and the haze of confusion had started to lift. I'd gone through the motions group therapy sessions. I hadn't asked for bland meals on plastic trays, being called Ms. Warren like I was a stranger to myself. I waited until a quiet hour after shift change when the hallway was clear. I walked calmly to the front desk, smiled, and asked for a taxi. The receptionist blinked. "You're not cleared for unsupervised exit," she said, checking her screen. "Your guardian hasn't approved your release." I felt like I'd been slapped. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, had the legal authority to tell me when I could leave a building. I was furious. I demanded to see the paperwork. They showed it to me. It was real, stamped, signed, dated. I'd been deemed mentally unfit based on falsified documentation and one manipulated video. No hearing, no chance to speak, no second opinion. And now, I was trapped. Natalie had orchestrated everything. The petition, the supporting statements, even the psychologist's evaluation. I recognized the name, Dr. Leonard Calver. He'd never met me before the day Natalie brought him into our house. One visit, one carefully guided conversation, and he wrote a report that framed me as paranoid, delusional, emotionally erratic. It was all there on file, justifying her control. That night, I was given new medication to help with anxiety, they said. I didn't swallow it. I hid it under my tongue, then spat it out into a tissue in my room. I Googled the name later when I got access to a staff computer during a supervised session. It was a mild sedative with long-term effects on cognition. Natalie hadn't just locked me away, she was trying to make the fiction real. If she kept me drugged long enough, maybe I would become the person she claimed I already was. That was when I knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was war. I started asking questions. I watched which nurses were attentive and which ones avoided eye contact. I made note of routines. I listened. I waited. And slowly I pieced together more of what she'd done. Natalie had moved into the condo the day after I arrived at Brookview, a 2-bedroom penthouse downtown, all paid in cash. She told the facility staff that I preferred not to be contacted while adjusting. She even forwarded my mail to her new address. She didn't just take my money. She took my voice, my presence, my life. And what made it worse was how normal it all looked on the surface. She was calm, poised, convincing. She told the court I had been struggling for months, that I had begged her for help, that she was doing what was best for me. No one questioned her. Not the bank, not the court, not even the neighbors. And I couldn't blame them, really. Natalie had always been persuasive, and I had always been the exhausted single mother who nodded and smiled and didn't push back hard enough. That's when it escalated. I confronted one of the senior staff, a woman named Harriet, and demanded to speak to a legal advocate. She said she'd make a note of my concern. I told her Natalie had lied, that I wasn't crazy. Harriet smiled gently and offered me tea. The next day, I was moved to a more secure wing of the facility. Less freedom, less privacy. For your safety, they said. Natalie's grip was tightening. I realized she had prepared for every step. She knew I'd resist eventually. She had put mechanisms in place to neutralize me, and I was running out of time. What I didn't know, yet what Natalie never expected, was that there was someone inside Brookview who was watching everything just as carefully as I was. Her name was Clara, a night nurse, maybe late 20s, with kind eyes and quiet instincts. She noticed I didn't take my medication. She saw how my hands shook not from illness but from rage and restraint. And she began asking me real questions, the kind that no one else bothered with. What do you remember from the day you arrived? Who signed the papers? Why aren't you on the phone with anyone? I told her the truth, all of it. And instead of brushing me off, she listened. That night, she slipped me a pen and paper with my dinner tray. If you write it, she said, I'll find someone to read it. It was a spark. Just one. But in a place designed to smother you, a spark can feel like fire. And I wasn't going to let it go out. Natalie thought I was buried, but she'd forgotten something. The deeper you push a woman like me, the more dangerous she becomes. The letter I wrote to Clara was short, but every word carried the weight of my desperation. I didn't bother with long explanations or emotion. I wrote like a woman who knew this might be her only shot at being heard. I wrote the names, the account numbers, the address of the condo Natalie had moved into, and a clear statement: I am not mentally ill. I am being held under false pretenses by my daughter, Natalie Warren. Please get this to someone who can help. Clara took it without a word. No promise, no reassurance, just a brief glance that said she understood. And then she was gone. For 3 days, I heard nothing. Each day passed like molasses. The nurses became colder. I could feel something shifting. Either Clara had betrayed me or something was coming. On the 4th day, it happened. A man showed up at Brookview wearing a dark gray suit and a face that looked carved from years of courtroom wars. He asked for me by name. The administrator tried to intercept him, but he pulled out a legal document. I was called to a private room. There, he sat at a table motionless as I was brought in under supervision. Ms. Warren, he said. My name is Mark Dandridge. I'm an attorney. I received a letter from someone named Clara, and I've reviewed your case. Everything about it is deeply wrong. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't overwhelmed, but because I couldn't afford to break not yet. Mark had already requested full access to the guardianship documentation and was in the process of filing an emergency injunction. He explained that Natalie had applied for temporary guardianship using what appeared to be falsified psychological assessments, bank records selectively edited, and a statement of support from someone posing as a family friend, someone who didn't exist. But the most damning part was the video. Mark had tracked down the original recording. What Natalie submitted to the court was a heavily edited, manipulated version of a conversation in which I expressed normal everyday exhaustion. The original showed me lucid, articulate, and aware. The cut version made me look delusional. She knew what she was doing, Mark said, and there was a hard edge in his voice. This wasn't a teenager acting out. This was a coordinated theft of autonomy. He told me he had already spoken to the bank. The transactions were suspicious. The condo purchase had red flags. And Derek, the boyfriend, was already under scrutiny for similar behavior in a previous relationship. She found the perfect playbook, he said. Exploit a legal gray area meant to protect vulnerable adults and use it to steal power from someone who trusted her. I felt something rise in me then. Not hope, exactly. Not yet. But clarity. The fog was gone. I could see the battlefield now. Mark promised me that the court had agreed to hear the emergency appeal within a week, but I would have to stay put until then. "Can you do that?" he asked. I nodded. I've been doing that longer than she's been alive. Before he left, he leaned in and whispered, "We're going to take it all back." That night, I didn't sleep. Not out of fear, out of anticipation. I stared at the ceiling and replayed every moment of Natalie's betrayal. I thought of the days I held her when she was sick, the nights I skipped meals so she could eat, the years I worked back-breaking shifts to make sure she never felt poor. And now she had tried to erase me, but Natalie had miscalculated. She thought I'd be too tired to fight, too drugged, too ashamed. But I wasn't any of those things now. I was ready. What she didn't know was that the court hearing wouldn't just be about overturning the guardianship. Mark had found something else. A clause in the financial power of attorney she had forged that granted her temporary control, but with a trigger condition if found to have acted in bad faith, the assets would revert with penalties. She had overreached. And now everything she took, every dollar, every asset, every lie was at risk. In 7 days, I would be sitting in a courtroom, and for the first time since the door closed behind me at Brookview, I would have a voice. Natalie had the money, the charm, and the fake smile, but I had something she'd never understand until it was too late. I had the truth, and the truth, when unleashed at the right moment, has a way of leveling everything in its path. The week leading up to the hearing was the longest stretch of time I had ever endured. Each morning I woke in the same stiff bed surrounded by beige walls and the quiet hum of controlled silence. But something had changed. The weight of helplessness had lifted. Clara began checking on me more often, always under the radar. She smuggled in updates from Mark on sticky notes folded in napkins or slipped inside books. Court hearing confirmed for Tuesday. Bank account freeze in process. Derek's record flagged under formal investigation. It felt like my world, once hijacked and rewritten, was being restored word by word. Brookview staff sensed something was off. The same administrators who used to smile politely now watched me with careful eyes. I was no longer the docile patient they expected. I walked straighter, listened more, talked less. I had a plan. More than that, I had proof. Mark had uncovered a paper trail. A digital forensics specialist traced the forgery Natalie used back to Derek's company email. Their fingerprints were all over the crime. In trying to cover their tracks, they'd made the ultimate mistake, assuming no one would be looking. But someone was. Clara had quietly reported Natalie's behavior to a state oversight board. She knew how elder abuse laws were changing, expanding to include financial exploitation, even when the victim wasn't technically elderly. She called in a favor from a legal aid group she used to volunteer with. They added their voices to Mark's motion. What started as a private appeal now had eyes from a growing coalition. Then came the journalist. Her name was Ava Chin. Young, sharp, and relentless, she'd been researching guardianship abuse cases for months, and when Clara anonymously leaked a tip, Ava latched on. One afternoon, a printed copy of her first article was left under my pillow. Young woman accused of exploiting mother under guardianship law loophole. Natalie's face wasn't in the paper yet, but her name was, and the article made its rounds quickly. Brookview staff were whispering. So was the legal team. By the time Tuesday arrived, I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. My case had become a headline, a cautionary tale. I was escorted to the courthouse in plain clothes, flanked by staff who no longer looked me in the eye. Mark was waiting outside with 2 assistants and a case file so thick it looked like a college thesis. When I stepped into that courtroom, the noise of the world dropped away. Natalie sat on the other side, perfectly dressed in a cream blouse and pearl earrings, her expression a mix of poise and quiet fear. Derek wasn't with her. He'd been subpoenaed and chose not to appear. Coward. The judge began by reviewing the emergency motion. Mark presented everything: the edited video, the falsified records, the questionable timing of the house sale. But what shifted the room was the timeline: how Natalie had coordinated my institutionalization to align with the property transfer, how she had moved in within 24 hours, how she had blocked every point of contact from me to the outside world. And then, finally, the statement, Clara's signed affidavit. She described the subtle signs that I was being subdued, not for safety, but for silence. The judge read it aloud. Natalie began to fidget. She tapped her nails on the desk, kept glancing toward the door, like hoping someone would burst in and save her. No one came. The judge's voice dropped an octave. Ms. Warren, what you've done here is not only unethical, but it appears to be criminal. You've manipulated a legal system designed to protect vulnerable individuals to instead strip your own mother of her autonomy and assets. Natalie opened her mouth. Your Honor. Silence, he snapped. Not another word. Then he turned to me. Isabel Warren, do you understand what's happening today? I stood slowly. I do, and I want it all back. You will have it, he said. Effective immediately, the guardianship is revoked and all financial control is returned to you. Additionally, this court recommends the initiation of criminal proceedings based on the evidence presented. I didn't smile. Not yet. I turned to look at Natalie, who now sat frozen. Her mouth slightly open, her future dissolving in front of her. Ava Chin stood in the back of the room, notebook in hand. Her eyes met mine. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But I had taken the first piece back my voice. And soon, everything else would follow. I didn't waste time once I walked out of that courtroom. The minute the guardianship was officially revoked, Mark handed me a prearranged phone and a slim folder of instructions. Every account Natalie touched was already frozen. The condo was flagged for seizure. All utilities, credit lines, and access to liquid assets had been severed under court order. Derek's firm was now under full financial audit, and the state attorney had opened a fraud investigation against both of them. But I wasn't satisfied with just taking back what was mine. I wanted them to feel what I felt: powerless, silenced, underestimated. So I started with the most obvious thing: visibility. Ava Chin's article was only the beginning. I sat down for a recorded interview 2 days later. We filmed in a quiet studio. She asked questions gently, but without apology. I told her everything. Every detail, from the moment Natalie brought the strangers into my kitchen to the second I saw the court papers that called me incompetent. I spoke with calm fury. I refused to be pitied. And when the interview aired, it exploded. Messages poured in from women across the country. Mothers, grandmothers, widows who had experienced similar betrayals. Some had lost homes. Others were still trapped under guardianship orders. My story gave them a blueprint. The media called it the Warren precedent. I called it overdue justice. Legally, I moved swiftly. We filed civil suits against Natalie and Derek for fraud, emotional distress, and unlawful asset transfer. But I didn't stop there. I filed an ethics complaint against Dr. Calver. Within weeks, his license was suspended pending investigation. The state began reviewing Natalie's actions under the expanded elder exploitation statutes, and even though I wasn't elderly by age, the intent was clear: she weaponized systems meant to protect the vulnerable for her personal gain. A week later, Natalie's face was on the news. Her polished photos contrasted against captions like, "Daughter accused of stealing mother's assets and guardianship loophole exposed." She called me finally. Her number lit up the screen like a ghost. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. "Mom, please, we need to talk. This is getting out of control." She sounded scared. Good. Let her feel that. I listened to it once, then sent it to Mark for evidence. That same day, I visited the condo. The building manager met me at the door. She hasn't been here since the story broke, he said. A few people tried to deliver things. Reporters, I think. I nodded. If she returns, tell her the locks have been changed. She doesn't live here anymore. He blinked. Legally fully, I said. I stepped inside and looked around. Every inch of that space had been redesigned in her image, Cold Gray's modern lines. Zero personality. Nothing of mine remained. I pulled my phone out and took pictures of everything. Documentation. Not for legal purposes, for closure. I had the locks changed within the hour. A week later, the court granted full asset recovery. Every cent Natalie had accessed, over $5 million, was now being redirected back to me along with restitution fees. She was cut off not just financially but socially. Derek's accounts were frozen, and when the IRS began asking questions, he ghosted. As far as I knew, he'd fled to another state, maybe even left the country. Natalie, for the first time in her life, was alone. That reality seemed to hit her when she showed up at my house. Not the condo, the old house. The one I reclaimed legally through civil reversal. She stood on the porch like she used to as a child, except now she was thinner, unkempt, stripped of her polish. Mom, she said when I opened the door, I made a mistake. I looked at her and felt nothing. No anger, no grief. Just the still, cold calm of someone who had outgrown needing an apology. You didn't make a mistake, I said. You made a decision. Repeatedly, with full awareness. I was scared, she whispered. I didn't know what I was doing. You knew enough to file court petitions, forge documents, and manipulate people. That's not fear. That's calculation. She looked like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words, so she just stood there, small and silent. I didn't invite her in. If you need help, I said there are public defenders and community programs. But you are not my problem anymore. She nodded slowly and stepped back. That night, I sat in my reclaimed kitchen with a glass of wine, watching the city lights through the window. I didn't toast to revenge. I toasted to reclamation. My voice, my life, my story, all mine again. Natalie was arrested 3 days later. It wasn't a dramatic scene. No SWAT teams or handcuffs on the evening news. Just 2 officers in plain clothes who waited outside her temporary housing and extended stay motel she'd checked into after losing access to the condo. They approached, calmly asked her to confirm her name, and read her the charges: felony fraud, financial exploitation, falsifying legal documents, and perjury. The arrest made local headlines. A once-celebrated youth entrepreneur now stood accused of manipulating the legal system to steal from her own mother. I watched the footage online expressionless. It didn't bring me joy exactly. It brought equilibrium. The balance had returned. Derek was picked up a week later in Nevada, where he'd tried to open a new account under a fake business name. The FBI got involved due to interstate wire fraud. The charges piled up fast. What had started as a slick con between a manipulative teenager and her greedy boyfriend had unraveled into a federal case. My story, once just a personal tragedy, had become the linchpin in a broader investigation. In court, Natalie sat beside her public defender, no longer the composed girl in designer clothes. She wore a standard beige jumpsuit. Her hair was tied back. Her face, once so smug, looked hollowed out. I testified at the preliminary hearing. I didn't embellish. I told the truth, cold, factual, devastating. I spoke about the betrayal, the isolation, the forged assessments, the sedation, the theft of my autonomy. I let the judge hear the words. My daughter had me drugged and institutionalized so she could steal my house. When I stepped down from the witness box, I didn't look at her. She had spent months pretending I didn't exist. I was simply returning the favor. The plea bargain came quickly. The evidence was overwhelming, and the DA wanted a quick resolution to send a message. Natalie took the deal: 18 months in a women's correctional facility, 5 years probation, mandatory restitution, and court-ordered therapy. Derek faced harsher terms, federal prison financial penalties, and a permanent ban from holding fiduciary roles. When the sentence was handed down, the courtroom was quiet. Natalie stood to speak. "I'm sorry," she said, voice shaking. "I thought I was helping. I thought I was protecting what we had." The judge didn't flinch. "You weren't protecting anything. You were exploiting it. You weaponized trust." Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. I made one brief statement. Let this be a warning: not every predator breaks in from outside. Sometimes they call you mom. After the sentencing, I received letters from Natalie, some handwritten, some typed. They varied. Some were remorseful, others defensive. One blamed Derek entirely. Another said she didn't know why she'd done it. I stopped reading them after the third one. I forwarded them to my attorney and told him to hold them in case we needed them later. I wasn't interested in apologies. I was interested in consequences. And for once, she was facing them. But legal justice wasn't the end. The deeper damage was harder to measure. I had spent months in isolation. My name had been tainted in records. I had missed time at work, lost trust in the systems I once believed in, and woken up more nights than I could count with the crushing fear that someone would take everything from me again. That doesn't vanish 'cause a gavel hits wood. So I started something new. I founded a nonprofit, the Isabel Initiative. Its mission was to support women targeted by family-based financial abuse. We offered legal resources, therapy referrals, and step-by-step guidance for escaping coercive guardianship. We held workshops. I spoke at conferences. I became what I needed back when I was alone in that nursing home room, staring at the ceiling tiles, wondering if I'd ever be believed. The initiative grew fast. Donations poured in. Survivors found us. Our message spread. People finally started to ask hard questions about guardianship law, financial control, and how easily the system could be weaponized by the very people it was meant to shield you from. One morning, 6 months after Natalie's sentencing, I received a letter from another woman across the country. Her daughter had petitioned for guardianship under suspicious circumstances. The woman had read my story. It helped her prepare her defense. She won her case. Her letter ended with one line: "Thank you for lighting the way out of the darkness." I sat with that sentence for a long time. It reminded me that the price Natalie paid wasn't just about prison time. She lost something deeper: my trust, my love, and the illusion that blood entitles you to mercy. Because family isn't a shield from accountability. Sometimes it's the reason accountability is needed most. Freedom felt different after everything. It wasn't loud or cinematic. It was quiet, grounded, like the moment after a storm when the world doesn't quite know what to do with itself. My first morning in the fully restored house, I walked barefoot through the kitchen, coffee in hand, and just stood there. No noise, no judgment, no oversight. Just silence and ownership. Real, personal, hard-earned ownership. The smell of fresh paint lingered in the hallways. The hardwood floors had been redone. Natalie had planned to gut the space, turn the living room into a tech-savvy influencer suite, whatever that meant. I undid all of it. Instead of gadgets and sterile colors, I filled the home with warmth. Rich earth tones, soft lamps, and shelves full of real books. I turned the guest bedroom into an art studio. I hadn't picked up a brush in 20 years. I used to paint before nursing school consumed my time. One afternoon, I stood in front of a blank canvas, hesitant. My hand shook for a moment before I made the first stroke. By sunset, I had finished a small piece, nothing grand, just a quiet landscape. But it was mine. I hung it in the hallway and wrote the date in the corner. It wasn't just about art. It was about taking up space again, unapologetically. I made other changes. I installed a new security system, not out of paranoia, but peace of mind. I updated my will, locked down every financial account, and appointed a professional fiduciary unrelated to me in case anything ever happened again. I taught myself how to navigate the financial tools Natalie had once used to trap me. I opened new accounts under fresh legal protections. I became, in every sense, untouchable. But more than that, I became visible. People stopped me at the grocery store. They'd seen the interviews, read the articles, heard the podcast. One woman hugged me so tightly I thought I'd break. "You spoke for all of us," she whispered. I didn't know what to say. I just held her. That's the thing about being erased. You don't realize how many others are fading too until you speak up. But the biggest shift was internal. I stopped apologizing. For my decisions, for my strength, for my boundaries. When an old friend asked if I planned to reconnect with Natalie after her release, I didn't hesitate. "No. Not even for the grandchildren if she has them someday," she asked. I sipped my coffee, especially not for them. Some cycles need to end. There was no malice in my tone, just clarity. I had learned something important. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. I could forgive her in time, but she no longer had a place in my life. That wasn't cruelty. That was survival. That was healing. I wrote a piece for a national magazine, What It Means to Be Betrayed by Your Child. It went viral. The response was overwhelming. Stories poured in. Women who had lost everything. Women who had fought back. Women still fighting. I realized then that my identity had shifted. I was no longer just a survivor. I was a force. The Isabel Initiative continued to grow. We secured funding for a legal clinic. We partnered with state representatives on guardianship reform. I testified before a committee in Washington. The irony was not lost on me. Just a year ago, I couldn't even call my own lawyer. Now I was helping write legislation. One evening, I received a letter not from Natalie, but from her attorney. She was requesting a supervised phone call not to ask for anything but to share reflections. I declined. I didn't need her reflections. I had my own. In my studio, I began work on a large self-portrait. It wasn't literal, more emotional. A woman standing in open light, her arms not raised in victory, but simply free. No chains, no shadows, just presence. I wasn't painting revenge. I was painting reclamation. A few months later, I was asked to be the keynote speaker at a National Elder Justice Summit. I accepted. I stood at the podium in a room full of lawmakers, advocates, and survivors, and I told them my story without trembling, without bitterness, and without shame. I lost everything I said, but I got myself back, and in doing so, I realized something. They didn't silence me. They revealed me. The room stood in applause. I stepped back from the mic, heart steady. Natalie had tried to erase me, but instead she introduced me to the most unshakable version of myself. And that was something no judge, no daughter, no system could ever take away again. 6 months after my story aired nationwide, I sat across from a panel of young law students in a university auditorium in Boston, the walls lined with portraits of past deans and alumni who'd gone on to change lives in courts and Congress. The moderator, a kind-eyed woman with short silver hair, asked the final question. Mrs. Warren, what advice would you give someone who suspects they're being manipulated by their own family? I took a breath, the kind that pulls from every part of your past. Don't wait for someone else to save you. Systems will fail you. People will fail you. But your instincts. If they're screaming, listen. The room went silent. The message hit. It always did. Not because it was novel, but because it was brutally true. Family betrayal cuts deeper than most people can admit aloud. That day, I stayed after the talk to speak one-on-one with dozens of attendees. Some asked about the legal process. Others whispered about their own mothers, fathers, siblings, abusers cloaked in kinship. I left that room with a stack of handwritten notes and tearful thank yous. And as I stepped into the cool fall air outside, I realized something. This was my legacy. Not Natalie's theft. Not Derek's betrayal. Not even the millions I'd reclaimed. My true legacy was this ripple effect of empowerment of other women refusing to be erased. But even legacies need boundaries. That night, I received another letter from Natalie, her 16th. I'd saved each one in a folder titled Evidence of Pattern, but hadn't read past the first few lines since the early days of her incarceration. This one came on court-approved stationery and bore a return address from the minimum security facility where she'd been transferred. I almost threw it away. Almost. But something made me pause. I opened it. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't blame Derek. She wrote about a restorative justice workshop she'd attended where victims and perpetrators were invited to write unsent letters. She called it a punch to the soul. She acknowledged the guardianship scam, the forgery, the public humiliation. She said, "You didn't deserve what I did. I used your silence as permission, your love as leverage. I thought if I framed it as protection, I could convince myself I wasn't a monster. But I was wrong. I reread that line several times. It didn't change anything. I didn't forgive her, but for the first time, I believed she was finally facing the truth. And that mattered. Not because I needed her back in my life, but because her future children, if she ever had any, deserved to be raised by someone who knew the cost of cruelty. I didn't respond, but I added that letter to a different folder, this one titled Acknowledgement. It was a subtle distinction, but a crucial one. A few weeks later, Ava Chin emailed me again. Netflix was moving forward with the dramatized series based on my story. They wanted to discuss casting. I told them to go ahead, but to remember one thing: I'm not the villain. And I'm not the victim either. I'm the line in the sand. They laughed. I didn't. They understood. The first check from the production rights went straight to the Isabel Initiative. We expanded into 5 states, opened 2 legal defense clinics, and funded research into guardianship abuse across the country. I became the unofficial face of the movement, but behind the scenes, I was just Isabel Warren, woman, mother, survivor, painter. I kept painting. Self-portraits, landscapes, even abstract storms that seemed to reflect my inner chaos. My studio filled with canvases until there was no more wall space. I started giving them away to women who wrote to me. Survivors, fighters, quiet warriors who had clawed their way out of silence. One painting, a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, her arms stretched wide, became our foundation's emblem. I named it Break the Cycle, because that's what this story was always about. Not revenge, not money, not legal victories. It was about refusing to pass down the sickness, the entitlement, the silence. I never reconciled with Natalie, but I never taught the world to hate her either. I taught them to recognize what she did and why, and to stop it before it happens again. Because it doesn't always start with a nursing home. Sometimes it starts with a sigh, a condescending look, a withheld check, a decision made for your own good. My final message to the public came in the form of a recorded speech aired during National Elder Awareness Month. I stood alone on a simple set. No props, no tears, just words. Family doesn't give you the right to destroy someone. Love without respect is not love. Protection without consent is not safety, and silence is not agreement. If you've been hurt, speak. If you've survived, teach. If you've escaped light, the path behind you. The cycle ends where you decide it does.